welcome back to Ravinheart Rendition Shop Time, and we're talking with Hendrik Varju again. How you doing, Hendrik?
Good. How are you, Andrew?
Good. I haven't had a whole lot of shop time lately, but I did get a chance to peruse the most of the first disc on your Sharpening and Tuning Hand Planes and Chisels DVD, and I'm loving it so far.
Good. So you didn't totally fall asleep then?
Yeah, no, not really. I think if my wife watched it, she might be sleeping, but I'm a little more interested in it than she is. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not the kind of thing you want to watch in one sitting anyway. It's too long, and there's so much detail you really can't absorb it all at one time.
Yeah, and the idea of having all of those discs. I mean, at first when you hear about, it's a 5-disc set or you know, but there's so much information, even just on the first disc that I had a chance to get through. There's so much there. I mean, first, you go through safety and it's just basic shop safety and some of the other things, and even that is informative in a way to think about it, and the first chapter, the sharpening stones and other supplies, it was kind of nice to see that, okay, hey, yeah, I have some of that stuff downstairs too, and there's so much to cover. It really covers it well.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I released 2 different discs or 2 different DVD sets, and the first one, the one we're talking about today, is just strictly sharpening and tuning.
Mm-hmm.
Of hand planes and chisels, and then the second set we'll talk about next month is strictly hand planing techniques, and we're talking like 9 or 10 hours, per set. But it sounds ridiculous to someone that doesn't know how much details involved in this kind of work. But for once you see it, if you've done this kind of work before, you realize, this isn't just a little highlight of this and that. I mean, I'm going to every last detail and lots of close-up shots so you can see every little step, right? So really, this is meant to actually teach you something, not just show off and say, "Hey, look what I can do."
And it really does. I mean, when you go through the different supplies that you need, even just to go through it, and you go through things that you don't necessarily use as much, but you show that there's other options out there, which is kind of nice to know. For example, I have some of the same things you use, and some of the stuff is a little different, but it's like, well, yeah, that worked like that one does.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to show some other options for people, but, there's so many ways to sharpen out there. First of all, I had the grinder itself, and talk about different wheel diameters and different kinds of wheels and stuff like that. But then you've got, I'm a big fan of water stones, but people do it with oil stones, people do it with sandpaper. There's so many ways, but I still feel like the ways that I've settled on as my favorite ways, work best for me. Not only because it might work better in my view, but also cost.
Yeah.
I don't want to, for example, use sandpaper as my main sharpening medium, because that means every time you wet the sandpaper, you use it for 5 strokes and you're done sharpening for that day, you're probably going to just crumple the paper up and throw it out because it's wet.
Yeah.
And, that really adds up cost-wise over time compared to having to shell out more money up front for a stone, but then using the stone for 10 years or whatever.
Yeah.
I have stones that are probably 10 years old and still going strong. And then when I think of people who are hobbyists who would sharpen way less than me, it might last them 20 years. So it's very, I'm also looking at the economics of what kinds of tools, work well, but also are economical in the long run.
Yeah. Now, how often, and I want to talk about some of the supplies and everything first, but one of the questions that I always hear people ask, and I am curious about how other people do it, is how often do you sharpen? And I know that's kind of a weird question because you can't really do it off of time. It's more off of usage and how do you know it feels dull, something like that. And a lot of people are, because I myself, I use the grinder for basic shaping. I use diamond stones to kind of finish the little bit of shaping that I want to do, or put little different things, and then I move to one of my stones, and then I kind of do the final honing with the sandpaper and a quick passes over that on glass.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I've been using hunting knives for so long. I know the feel when it's a little dull, and I hone them in the middle instead of going to the grinder every time.
Right. Yeah. Well, you'll notice in this video that I have a whole chapter on hollow grinding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So to me, that's just the shaping of the tool. I do it on a 6-inch grinding wheel, so I get a fairly deep hollow grind.
Mm-hmm.
Then I do my honing, which for me usually means 1,000 grit, then 4,000, then 8,000. Now, when you do that, when you do the honing, because it's a hollow ground tool, you only get a shiny section at the tip and the heel of the chisel, and it's all hollow in between.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I just keep honing the tool over and over again until both shiny points meet in the middle, which means my hollow grind is gone, essentially, and then that's when I would go back to shaping. Okay, but in terms of how often do I actually hone, that obviously has a lot to do with, like you said, not just time, but what are you cutting? If I was cutting something like teak, it's not going to last nearly as long as a softer wood.
Yeah.
But I mean, I find it easier. Well, first of all, if I've got a bunch of chisels hanging on the wall on a rack, the first thing I do before I even pull the chisel off the rack is I run my finger down the back of the chisel from the handle and down to the tip.
Mm-hmm.
If I feel any burr whatsoever when I do that, I know right away that isn't, primo sharp.
Mm-hmm.
So I have 3 sets of chisels. So if I slide my finger down the 1-inch 2 cherries chisel and that one's not sharp, then I feel the Veritas one or the Stanley one, and whichever one's sharp I grab.
There you go.
Now sometimes when I'm teaching a student and I show them that, when they first start woodworking, they might not have the sensitivity in their fingers that I do, and they might kind of have trouble feeling what I'm talking about because it's a very subtle burr usually.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you've really let it go for a long time.
Yeah.
But then I'll show them, if you hold the chisel up and look at the tip of it in reflected light, a sharp chisel doesn't reflect light off the actual tip because it comes down to, in theory at least, 0 thickness.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as we see little dots of light bouncing off the tip, that means the metal has become damaged there. So it's rounded over or dented in or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another good way to tell. Now, when I'm dealing with hand plane blades, you can't really see it as well when you're using it in the body.
Sure.
But it's hard to describe. But when I want to take just 1 thou off something or even less, like let's say I'm trimming edge banding and planing from, let's say, a plywood surface into a raised edge of solid edge banding that's been glued on.
Mm-hmm.
With a very sharp chisel or hand plane, I can take 1 thou off.
Mm-hmm.
When the plane starts getting duller, you'll find that the plane is kind of rising up off the wood, and you're not able to take that light shaving anymore. And I kind of have to crank the depth of the blade down a little more to get it to dig in more.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I know I'm really fighting this thing. I really should be going to sharpen.
Okay.
If the job's almost done, I might just crank it down an extra thou and go for it and take my chances. But really it means it's time to sharpen. And then the other thing I can do is turn the plane over and look at the blade on the underside. And if there's any light reflection at the very tip, that's caused by wear at the tip, and a lot of it's caused by dragging your plane backwards on the surface, like without lifting it.
Yep.
So that's another way to tell. But basically, every time the thing about sharpness is you go from very sharp to not sharp in a gradual way.
Yeah.
So it's not like it just suddenly becomes not sharp instantly. So it's a gradual process, and most of the time, by the time you start thinking, well, maybe this isn't sharp, you probably should have already sharpened it 5 minutes ago. Like you always, after you sharpen it and you use it again, you immediately notice the difference and you say, wow, I should have done that earlier.
Oh, yeah.
But we're trying to balance working time versus sharpening time because, you can't sharpen every 3 minutes. So you need to find a good balance between the two, right?
Sure. Now, the other thing, too, you cover in these DVDs flattening and tuning up hand planes and chisels. Now, as
Right.
far as the hand planes go, you were mentioning if you turn it upside down, how often? I guess I've flattened my plane, the bottom of my planes
Hmm.
once.
The soul of the
Yeah,
plane.
the sole. Sorry,
Yes.
the word escaped me.
Yeah.
Do you have to go back and redo that often, or I mean,
Yeah.
I've done mine once. I tuned them up. They work great. I've never thought about doing it again.
Yeah. I would say if you have an old plane, or you have, I mean, first of all, if you buy a really good quality plane, like a Lee Nielsen Veritas or whatever, something relatively expensive,
Mhm.
they're already flattened for you,
Sure.
or they should be at least. If they weren't, I would return it and get another one.
Yeah.
Those ones don't need to be touched. Okay, so in the video, I do show some of those nicer planes, and I also show, a less expensive, cheaper version of a Stanley and some older planes, whatever,
Sure.
so that people with old planes can also tune them. I would say if you're tuning an old plane, um, generally you flatten it once and you're done.
Mhm.
But if you buy a really cheap low-end plane made today,
Mhm.
usually overseas,
Yeah.
I don't think they've aged to casting or de-stressed it the way they used to.
Oh.
And I find those kinds of planes, you can flatten it and then a year later kind of notice it's not great and maybe have to do it a little more. I mean, it's never like you have to do it all over again from scratch, but I do think, cast iron moves over time, and the longer the manufacturer, lets the metal relax before they flatten it in the factory, and different qualities of, there's a lot of science behind metalwork.
Yeah.
I think if you buy a $30 plane, there's a good chance you have to do it more than once. But if you buy, at least $100 plane, maybe a little better made, it should, in theory, at least be a one-time deal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And most of the ones, well, actually, all of the planes that I use are all very old Stanleys or some of the newer stuff that you've been talking about. I actually have um, one set of the cheap ones that you're talking about. They work one as a paperweight and one as a nice bookend in the garage.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
that.
I mean,
Mhm.
that. I mean, the same thing goes for jointer beds and everything else. Cast iron is still considered, after it's made, almost like a liquid, like internally, just like glass, right?
Mhm.
That's why like a window will be thicker on the bottom than the top on an old window, because it's actually flowing inside still, even though it seems like a solid material. It really isn't over a very long period of time.
Well.
So if you put a big stack of heavy boards on the tip of your 8-inch joiner, like sticking way out,
Mhm.
and you leave it sitting there for 3 or 4 months, I bet you that table will start bowing down, because of all the weight you left on the tip for so long.
Oh well.
So, cast iron isn't, it isn't sort of flattened once and it's forever, but when you're dealing with a hand plane, which is such a small surface, I think it pretty much, is a one-time deal on a well-made one.
Mm.
But on the cheapest ones out there, I just don't think the quality of the metal and the way it's made is just at the right standard that they used to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the my opinion is some of the really cheap ones that the ones you can pick up in the shrink wrap plastic stuff for $10. They're
Yeah.
nice. They're nice to learn sharpening and flattening, and same thing with some of those cheap chisels. And I use some of the cheap chisels I got when I first started doing this for more construction work. Where, well, if I ding it up, I'll just grind it off. Who cares?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I saw a hand plane on sale in this flyer here in Canada, and it said $7.99, right? Like on sale, and I thought, gee, I wonder if it's normally like $99, and that for some reason they discontinued it, and they're blowing it out at $7.99. Well, it turned out it just said reduced from $9.99. So I'm thinking, well, what kind of plane can you make for $10?
Yeah, really.
A couple of cups of coffee at Starbucks cost more than that, I
Yeah.
think. So, anyways, you do get what you pay for, and it used to be you either had to buy old planes and tune them yourselves, or buy a super expensive plane that you just couldn't afford.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're starting to see good quality planes in a more reasonable price point. I mean, I wouldn't call them cheap, but but they're a little more attainable for people.
Sure.
And companies like Veritas have some very good product, and it's expensive, but it's not out of this world. So just like any good tool, buy a good one, but buy one or two at a time. It's better to have 2 or 3 really good planes instead of 12 junky ones. So,
yeah.
But having said that, in the video I show you how to take an older plane and tune it, and I've done it many, many times myself and with students. And it is possible to take a plane that's old like that and make it perform as well as an expensive plane. So it's nice to do that. Also, if you have an old plane that has some sentimental value, like it's from your father or grandfather or something like that, then you want to put that into use.
Yeah.
So, and not only that, but I find personally, tuning a plane is a process I think almost everyone should at least learn one time, even if they're going to buy all really nice, planes that don't need the tuning. If only to understand your plane better.
Yeah.
I mean, working on every single part of the plane and improving it on an older one will teach you what the plane is, how it's made, what the parts do, how they fit together. And to me, that's pretty important stuff just to learn how to use it well too.
Oh yeah, the knowledge you pick up of each little part, and then knowing, okay, I can move this just a little bit, and it changes the cut, and it changes how much it's going in, and like I took one of a number 5 and basically turned it into the name escapes me right now, cambered blade, and you take off a lot. Yeah.
I know what you mean.
For flattening quickly,
For rough lumber.
Yeah, for taking down
the blade. Scrub plane.
Scrub plane, that's it.
Scrub plane, yeah. So you put like a massive camber on the blade and just use it to rough out a board.
Yeah, and I did that, and and I did that with help from other people. And just knowing what those planes can do, and okay, if I switch the blade out, move the frog forward, it changes everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of parts in there, and that's the thing. I mean, someone who doesn't know a lot about planes and hasn't really taken them apart, when they're buying a plane, they might not know what a good plane versus a bad one looks like. Like, with a good plane, and you take it apart, you can see the machining that's been done, and you can tell it's good compared to a cheaper one, and you can see sort of rougher marks on the metal where the milling machines were grinding, and you can just see this one is really well made, and this one is kind of coarse, and there's some burrs here and there, and the manufacturer sprayed some paint over top of the frog, stuff like that. It does make a difference.
Sure. Yeah. No, the same thing goes with some of the supplies too. I mean, the first part of the first part of the first DVD, you talk about the sharpening stones, and the other supplies that you need to kind of do some of this stuff. Now I've used everything from ceramic stones and oil stones to, I have a couple of water stones, but most of mine are either diamond or oil, and it's mainly because that's what I grew up using. And you prefer water stones, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I use a lot of Norton water stones. I also showed some newer ones that Lee Valley carries. One's called Bester, one's called Imanishi, which are ceramic stones. They don't have to be stored in water, but I tend to, just because I have a big container full of all the stones.
Oh, sure.
And then I showed, your typical diamond stone, as well as some sort of diamond-coated steel plates. And then, some fine sandpaper. I showed a few different things, but I have an old oil stone in my cabinet that I use when I need to take a burr off a bolt head or something.
Yeah.
I don't want to wreck my good stone. But once I started using water stones, I never touched an oil stone after that. It was, big revelation to me. Now, you have to keep on top of the water stones, though, keeping them flat, and that takes some effort. But, I showed in the video that every time I pull a stone out of the water and I'm about to use it, I rub it on my flattened 220 stone, or you could rub it on a diamond stone, just to make sure it's flat before I start. As soon as I'm done sharpening, I'm anxious to get back to work, so I just put it back in the water without re-flattening it.
Oh, okay.
So my routine is to flatten just before use. Other people might flatten as they put it away. It doesn't matter, but you do have to have a routine so that you know your stone's always flat every time you use it.
Mm. Now
Right? So if I sharpen like 2 chisels, like 2 1-inch chisels on one side of a stone, then I can flatten 2 more on the other side. And then it's not that out of flat, like it isn't flat, but it's not that bad. So the flattening process on a water stone would take me maybe 20 seconds per side.
Okay.
So I'm not talking about a big drawn out process. It's just something you have to remember to do constantly.
Yeah. I know, oil stones, they don't wear quickly at all, and, they take a long time to wear, but once they do have a little bit of dish to them, they take considerably longer to flatten.
Yeah, because silicon carbide is very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually I just wait till it's crooked and then sell it to somebody.
There you go. And then let them flatten it. Now, you mentioned the diamond stones and the diamond plates. Now, I have a yellow on one side, blue on the other, and it's the traditional, the little round spots in it. Now, what's the difference between that and the plate? Really?
Well, the one with the plastic you're talking about, it's like a plastic core, and then there's a metal kind of open mesh top with diamond impregnated into it.
Mm-hmm.
That's nice in the sense that the holes in the metal allow the swarf to have somewhere to go, so the stone doesn't sort of clog.
Yeah.
Right? But sometimes those stones, depending on the quality and who you bought it from, might not be as flat as you think. I find sometimes the core is actually curved a little bit. So what you also saw in that video were some new products. I don't know, maybe I got them a year ago or a little more than a year ago from Lee Valley, and it was a diamond-coated steel plate. So in that case, as long as the steel was made flat, the surface never goes out of flat. But because you don't have those holes for the swarf to go to, you have to flush it often as you use it.
Oh, okay.
Because it's kind of getting clogged as you use it. So you might use it for a few minutes, and then all I do is dip it in water and turn it over and start using it again.
Okay.
It only takes a second, right?
Sure.
So anyways, I keep mentioning Lee Valley because that's all we have here in Canada.
Well, they make very, very good stuff. I have some of their products myself. I have no problem talking about them.
Yeah. And one of the things in the video too is I talk about honing guides versus no honing guide.
Yeah.
And I'm personally a big fan of no honing guide, and that's what I teach people.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned in the video some circumstances where I do use a honing guide for something that I find too difficult to do freehand. But the only reason I even hollow grind in the first place is so that I can freehand hone. That's the only reason.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in other words, you don't need a hollow grind to get a sharp tool. I'm doing it so that I can now balance the tool on 2 points on a stone, which I can feel very well as long as the tool isn't too thin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my reason for not wanting to normally use a honing guide, because I can sharpen a dozen chisels faster than you might be able to do 3 using a honing guide, just because I don't have to put it in the honing guide and set it up each time.
Sure.
Right. So I try to cover a wide variety of different ideas and techniques, but definitely most of the video is this is how I prefer to do it, and here are all the reasons why, and let me show you how to do it this way. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that hollow grind. I mean, when you're when you go to do the touch up in between, when you're just honing instead of shaping on that, make it so fast to not have to pick up that honing guide, to just register, set the back down, register it, set your tip, you're solid, your few passes on each grit, and you're off to the races.
Yeah. No. Every time you re-hone, the 2 shiny points at the tip and the heel do get a bit wider.
Mm-hmm.
So every subsequent honing, you do have to rub a little bit longer.
Yep.
If you threw it in a honing guide, like for example, the Veritas honing guide has a little dial you can turn to crank up the angle by just 1 degree. So you can increase the angle of the tool by just 1 degree, and now you're only sharpening the very tip. So you might get it done in as little as 3 strokes.
Sure.
Okay, but next sharpening, you want to go up 1 more degree. It actually can. It goes a 1 and a 2.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the next sharpening, the third, you've kind of run out of places to step it up.
Mm-hmm.
So you would now, probably go to a coarser stone, bring it back to your normal angle, like your primary bevel,
mm-hmm.
and just grind away at it to reestablish a new primary. In my case with hollow grinding, I don't have primary and secondary bevels or tertiary bevels. It's all just 1 tangent point, like that gives you the hollow curve, followed by a single honing at the same angle to the tangent point. It's simpler, but yeah, to me it's very effective because I don't have to, set it up in a guide, but I cover it all in the video. I say, here's how I do it, and I encourage you to practice this method using these kinds of tools, which are easier, like big chisels and thick blades. And if you try for several months and you fail, you can always jump on a honing guide later. I got nothing against it.
Yep.
But, sometimes learning the other method first is actually more successful because you're not relying on the guide. I sort of think of it as like training wheels on a bike. They're great, but you get to rely on them so much you have trouble ever getting them off. But on the other hand, sometimes I sharpen the blade that's very hard to do freehand, and I've got the honing guide there anyway. So let's grab it and do this one tool, right?
Yeah. So what kind of tools do you find you need the honing guide for? Because it's too hard to.
Well, for example, a spoke shave blade is, if it's a thick one, I have no problem doing that freehand. But if it were a thin one, basically the thinner the tool is, the shorter the bevel is at any given angle.
Sure.
Okay, so if it's a very thin tool, like for example, let's say it was a Stanley plane with a normal Stanley blade in it, quite thin, they're very difficult to learn freehand.
Okay.
And that's why with a beginner here, if I had a Veritas blade or Lee Nielsen or something like that, and it's a thick one, I can teach that beginner how to do it successfully, maybe even on their first or second try. With a 1-inch chisel, I can teach them too. I would never try to start them out on a 1/4-inch chisel or a 1/8-inch chisel or a thin Stanley blade, because they're not going to succeed. It's hard for me to do those too.
Okay.
So that's one example. Another example is, I have a card scraper, or sorry, not a card scraper, but a scraper plane.
Oh, sure.
It has a fairly thin blade, and it has a 45-degree angle on it before you put the burr on. Well, that I can't balance freehand. It's so thin.
Yeah.
I just can't register. I can't register on anything. So that goes in the honing guide. It fits in the Veritas one also.
Okay.
And another example I give, I'm trying to think. I think it may be in the second DVD set on hand planing techniques, but I talk about effective cutting angles and the fact that normally with a bevel down plane, all of your effective cutting angles are 45 degrees. They're the same as the frog angle. But then I say, oh, by the way, if you need to get a higher effective cutting angle, you can do it by putting a tiny micro bevel on the back of the blade. And we're talking about an angle that's quite low, like it might be 15 degrees or 10 degrees.
Okay.
Okay, well, that's kind of hard to do freehand. I mean, if I really didn't have a honing guide, I could lay the plain blade on a stone with something under the blade, like a thin block of wood, or you may have heard of the ruler trick that David Charlesworth in England uses, where he lays a little thin stainless steel ruler on the stone.
Yep.
That would be a way to get a very low angle micro bevel on the back of a blade freehand. But if I have the honing guide up there, like the Veritas, and it can do a 15-degree angle, well, why not just throw it in there and let's go and get it done?
Sure.
Right? So there's another example where I would use a honing guide just for that one process.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Trying to think, there was a few other things that I was going through that I was going to ask you about. And, excuse me, one part of that first disc that I liked was the way you go through the steps of tuning a chisel and tuning a hand plane and how they work together. You're going through the steps in a way that shows people how to do that, to understand it. And it's nice to get that, because sometimes you just need that little bit of a, oh yeah.
Yeah, chapter 2, I go through all the steps on my easel on paper, and I number them, I write them out, I explain them. And then as we go through more chapters in the video, each chapter is devoted to showing you maybe 1 or 2 of those steps in major detail, like lots of close-ups and stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you haven't seen all my videos, but I always have that easel. I'm constantly drawing on it. There's so many things that I can explain, but it might not register till you see me draw even the shape of it on the board. As soon as you see that, you're like, oh, now I get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of drawing things. Yeah, I draw them all the time. Actually, I got an email from someone recently, And he said, I like the way you're drawing the board so much that I have an easel and I write down what you're writing down while I'm watching it. Seems a little obsessive, but he said, he says, if I listen to you talk, it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. But if I write it out while I'm listening, taking notes, in other words, then it sinks in, right? Because your brain has to work a little harder to write it down, I guess.
Yep.
So I'm a big fan of writing out things and drawing it, and some people might think it's a little old style because it could be done on a computer in the DVD, but the whole idea is you're standing here live in my shop learning from me, and that's how I would do it, is on a notepad or something in front of you, right?
Yeah. I like the idea that you're going through it, and it really does feel like, okay, I'm taking a class here. This is kind of cool.
Yeah. Trying to hammer it down in your head a little bit by there's a lot of things where I'm talking about effective cutting angles and things like that where really it wouldn't mean much to you unless I was drawing it on the board, like to show you the shapes I'm talking about.
Yeah, there's no way to picture that without showing what's going on, and it's hard to show with a plane or a chisel on a,
Yeah. I mean, we did some close-ups in the video where I sharpened something, and we actually filmed it through a 10 times magnified loop, right?
Oh, wow.
We actually filmed through it to show you the difference between one that was sharp and that one that was dull. So it's not like a microscope, photograph through a microscope. It isn't that magnified, but it's magnified enough that you can see what's going on. And that's the hard thing about teaching someone sharpening, is that you do have to get that close up to see it and get the light bouncing off it just right. So even when I'm doing it in person with somebody, they're still like holding it up to the light and squinting and saying, "What are you talking about? Where?"
Yeah, and once you see it, it's like, "Oh, there it is."
Yeah, and then I hand them a loop and say, "Well, look through this," and they look, "Oh, now I see what you're talking about." Right?
Cool.
Well, that's a bit hard to pick up on a camera, but
yeah,
we did our best.
Cool. There's one piece of equipment that you on the first DVD that you showed, but I've seen one, but I've never been able to use one, and it was I think it was the large, like a lapping stone, I guess you'd call it, plate.
Okay.
Now, is that something?
The big steel plate with the grooves in it?
Yeah, and you use that more for like flattening the planes, correct?
Well, it's because that plate isn't that big. You would never use that to lap a big plane like a number 5.
No.
You could use it to lap a block plane or a little apron plane.
Okay.
Or probably more people would use it to lap the back of a chisel.
Okay.
Okay, but that was just a steel plate, so you need to sprinkle silicon carbide powder on it.
Okay.
And a lubricant, like maybe some kerosene.
Okay.
Okay, then I also showed in the video those diamond-coated plates. So in that case, I'm lubricating with water and just rubbing right on the diamond.
Okay.
And see, the other one, because it has the grooves in it, the silicon carbide powder goes down into those grooves to get out of your way.
Yeah, the sword can get out of the way.
Yeah, whereas the other one gets a bit clogged, and I have to flush it all the time.
I was curious about that piece, and you may go on to the other discs and cover it more or not. I'm not sure, but I was curious how that piece worked, and I wasn't sure if, did you use that for flattening other things, or did you use that for flattening the planes? And I was like, that's a bigger one.
Yeah, it was bigger, but still not massive. Like, it's bigger than a regular stone size.
Yeah.
But it was still maybe, 4.5 inches wide and maybe 12 inches long.
Okay.
So it's not that big. You definitely wouldn't lap a big plane on it.
No, it wouldn't be.
But like the thing that you're always balancing between is if you use silicon carbide powder on steel or certainly on glass, then even the surface you're lapping on goes out of flat from the silicon carbide. Like glass actually goes out of flat fairly quickly. So I mentioned in the video, sometimes you get a brand new piece of glass, check it with a straight edge, and it's really straight, just from the way it's manufactured. And you lap a plane, going in a circular motion or figure eights or whatever. Well, the glass always gets dished out in the middle over time.
Sure.
So if it's a very short plane, like a block plane, even if the glass is somewhat curved, still you can usually get it pretty flat. But if you don't realize the glass is wearing, and then you take a number 4 plane and put it in that bowl-shaped glass, you'll actually make your plane convex.
Oh, that's not good.
So I show that maybe you can use one side of the glass for 2 planes, or maybe one number 4 and 2 block planes because they're small.
Sure.
And the glass is always stays flat around the perimeter. So even if I know the glass is crooked in the middle, I'll put a straight edge across the perimeter, check with feeler gauges, and confirm it isn't flat. It isn't out of flat there. And then I might say, all right, I'll get away with flattening one block plane, just going straight back and forth on the perimeter. To use up the glass basically. And then once the whole side is so crooked it's useless, flip the glass over, use the other side, and then recycle it at the end and buy a new piece. Right?
Sure.
But I mean, to me, a piece of glass, I don't buy new glass. I go to the glass shop and say, "Where's your broken glass section?"
Yeah.
Right? And they say, "Well, over there in the corner is a bunch of broken ones." And they've got to be regular glass because tempered glass can't be cut.
Yeah.
So you find the glass and you say, "Okay, here's a weird shaped one. Can you just cut it into a rectangle and grind the corners for me so I don't get cut myself?" And usually it's about half price or even less if it's a sort of a remnant, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll use that glass on 2 sides. Maybe I get to lap a total of 5 planes or 6 planes if they're smaller ones, and then recycle it and buy another one, right?
Yeah.
But if I had done all the lapping with sandpaper and not silicon carbide on glass, I would have gone through way more value of sandpaper, like cost-wise, compared to throwing out a $10 piece of glass.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems kind of weird that you're throwing the glass out, but believe me, economically speaking, the sandpaper costs more because, it's not cheap when you get into higher grit sandpaper.
No,
$1 or $2 a sheet, easy. So
yeah, and
you're whipping through the stuff. Next thing you know, you've gone through $25 worth, right?
Yeah, pretty quickly, and that's why, like mine, I've mentioned I use sandpaper for some of my really high honing stuff, but I mean, and that's real high honing. I'm not flattening or doing anything with the sandpaper. That's
like micron paper.
Yeah.
Like I usually go to 8,000 grit. At that point, I can shave my arm, and I feel that's sharp enough.
Yeah.
Some people, you can buy a Shapton stone, ceramic stone. I think they come up to something like 45,000 grit, like crazy high.
Oh.
I mean, I know they used to go up to about 25, 30,000, but I think they've pushed it even higher now. And yes, it gets sharper, but I had how my videos at the end always have this thoughts on woodworking. 3 things where they're only about 3 minutes each, and I just yap on about some theory in my head. Well, one of them on this video is called Diminishing Returns on Sharpness. And I mentioned how, if I want to go beyond 8,000 grit, yes, it is getting sharper, but that extra bit of sharpness is lost in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
There's a point where you have to cut it off. For me, that's 8,000. For really fine work, 8,000 to me is enough.
Okay.
But there's always going to be someone out there who's into like incredibly detailed inlay work or something, and they say, no, I can't live with under 30,000 or 25,000. Whereas if I'm sharpening a mortising chisel, like a hollow chisel, hollow mortising chisel, for that tool I only go 1,000 grit, no higher.
Okay.
Sometimes I get a little anal and I do a little 4,000 or something, but for that kind of tool that's just forced into the wood with that lever, I don't find that going higher than 1,000 really does a whole lot for me.
First whack with the hammer, anything over that's probably gone.
Yeah. And when I take the burr off a card scraper so I can reburnish it, I only do 1,000 grit. I don't go higher.
Okay.
That's covered in a whole other DVD series. So.
Yeah. But speaking, just a real quick question. I know the only thing I really do this on is I do a little bit of carving. I'm learning. It's kind of pathetic right now, but I'm learning to do it. And when I sharpen my carving tools, a lot of it is you can actually strop them in the middle and just return that really, really sharp. Because I'm using pretty soft wood to carve in, and you strop them in the middle. And I've done it where as I was learning stuff, I've stropped the chisels now and then after the sharpening, and it makes them shinier. I know that, but how much really does that add to a chisel? I know a carving tool, you can pretty much strop it a whole bunch of times and just keep it before you got to go back to the sharpening.
I'll tell you what my worry is with stropping. When you're doing a carving tool, that's something you're using freehand.
Mm-hmm.
So you're able to alter the angle of the handle to whatever happens to work in a certain circumstance.
Sure.
Without even knowing you're doing it, you are changing the angle until it grabs just right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when you strop it and you're maybe putting a bit of a roundness to the tip, you're increasing the cutting angle of the tool, but you might not realize you are because you're now maybe just lifting the handle a little higher before you cut. And since it's now sharper, it's also easier to push, and everybody's happy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but with a chisel, if I were to strop the bevel side, technically that's okay, although I am increasing the cutting angle.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to strop the back of it, I'm rounding the back, effectively almost putting a micro bevel on it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now if I want to hold the chisel back flat on a surface and cut something flush, it won't do it because the tip's up above the surface a bit.
Oh, so it'd really be bad to do with a paring chisel.
Yeah, I don't strop at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people that do, but often they end up rounding the tip in ways that makes your work more difficult.
Okay.
So I feel like, to me, that is more of a carving thing.
Yeah.
But there's so much risk with other tools of increasing the cutting angles or putting micro bevels on, you can barely see that it does affect how the tool works.
Yeah, and with the carving tools, it's one of those things, like you said, you're freehanding. Your cutting angle is whatever you want it to be. And with a chisel, I've never done it with my chisels, and I always wondered. I'm like, I don't know why I don't. I just don't.
And what are you using? Like a diamond paste or some other kind of?
I actually have the same paste that you can buy for the Tormac grinder that I use on just a piece of leather that I glued to a board.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you can take the same kind of honing compound or diamond paste and grind it into the face of a piece of maple.
Hmm?
And you could effectively use that piece of maple as if it were a stone.
Oh.
And you would increase the sharpness of the tool, but without the risk of rounding that you'd get with leather.
Oh, that's an idea. Huh.
So that would work. You just got to remember it is a piece of wood, so it's not going to stay flat forever.
Yeah,
but
no.
you're talking a few little minor strokes at the end that would work. I mean, people put diamond paste on like a dowel rod and use that to sharpen a carving tool if they can match the radius, right?
Yeah.
So that's another idea. I mean, I don't cover that carving tools in this video. It's strictly chisels and hand planes. But
and carving tools
I'm not a carver.
Carving tools are a whole different thing. I've like I said, I'm just barely learning, and what I made a fish, and it looks like a fish, so I'm happy so far. But it's something I do just to kind of play and learn something different. But man, you if it ain't razor sharp, you don't want to try using it because it's actually more dangerous than than if it was sharp.
Yeah, carving's a whole other skill. It could take quite a few years to master. I have some miniature carving tools, and I've had jobs like on antiques where a small carving was missing, and I did it myself. And in the end, it went well, but it took me forever compared to someone who's used to carving.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other skill. That's not something I really practice.
Yeah. Well, the bonus footage disc I'm looking forward to getting to as well, where you cover the cambering hand plane blades and the thoughts on woodworking, and that I've got to watch the other ones first. I'm not letting myself watch bonus footage before the other stuff. So.
Right.
I guess now I know like we talked about before. Cambering like a scrub plane is a pretty radical camber. It's pretty big.
Yeah.
And I know there's a little bit of camber on some of my other planes. Do you put some on all of yours, or I guess everybody has their own way of thinking about that. How do you do the cambering?
Well, I don't camber any tool that has to cut right to the corner.
Mm-hmm.
So a chisel cannot be cambered because you often do have to cut right to the edge of the chisel.
Mm-hmm.
And any plane where the blade cuts right to the outside, such as a shoulder plane, can't be cambered.
Nope.
Okay, so a shoulder plane or a rabbet plane, a rebate plane, whatever. But all my other planes are cambered. My number 4, my 5, my 7, my block planes, whether low angle or not, low angle or standard, all of them. And
cool.
That was something I probably didn't start doing till, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I started tinkering with it, and I started realizing how much you gain by having a round blade. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but in my second DVD set, the one on hand planing techniques, I keep talking about the camber, and while I'm working, I'm saying this is why I can do this, because this is cambered. The blade doesn't even cut in the corner. So, for example, I show in the second video how to. Actually, I showed also a little bit in the bonus footage of the first disc, or the first production. I show how to remove the twist from the edge of a board, which I can only do because the blade is cambered. Very hard to do with a straight blade.
Oh, sure.
Because if I'm cutting straight ahead with the blade centered and the blade's cambered, just a couple of thou, I'm cutting a small little hollow in that edge. But then I can start pushing the plane over to the side so that the blade isn't centered on the board. And I can remove more wood from one side of the edge and no wood from the other side, such that I'm changing the angle of that edge without even moving the plane. Like I'm still flat on the wood the whole time.
Cool.
So I got a lot of control over removing twist, and then I also show in the second production how to trim edge banding and solid wood and iron-on. And the camber is very important when I'm planing wood next to veneers, because one wrong move on the veneer, you can destroy the plywood next to you.
Yeah, and they keep getting thinner, I think, too. So.
Oh, they're thin, yeah. So just by moving the plane further towards the, outside of the wood I'm trimming, so that the corner of the blade's over the veneer, it actually can't cut there at all because it's not even sticking out of the sole yet.
Oh, sure.
So I show in the bonus footage. I forget how long it is, but I'm guessing it's at least an hour long for the bonus footage alone, because it's its own disc, so it's long.
Oh yeah.
And it shows how I do the camber, which is on the grinder freehand, and then how to make sure you maintain the camber when you hone, because if you just held it like normal, you would remove the camber. And the camber across the whole width of, let's say, a number 4 blade is only a few thou total, but when it's a few thou when the blade is like when you're looking at the blade holding it 90 degrees, like right in front of your face. But then when it goes in the plane, it sits on a 45-degree frog. The camber presented to the wood surface is even more subtle than what you just put on it.
Oh, sure.
And then when you go to a standard angle block plane, which is bedded at 20 degrees, the same camber is even less in the wood. And then at 12 degrees on a low angle block plane, there's even less.
Okay.
So the hard part about cambering is I have to camber a different amount for a number 4 bevel down plane versus a standard block and a low angle block. They all need a different amount of camber. And yet I'm doing all of it freehand without any kind of jig. So a lot of it comes with, practice and feel, and sometimes I still get it wrong. But basically I'm grinding on the grinder to put a curve on it, and then very often I'm picking it up off the tool rest and holding it at 90 degrees on a block of wood and holding it up against the window to see how much curve is really there. And then with enough practice, you start to notice, okay, this one's perfect. This one I've over-cambered. Let's go back and grind the center out a little more, depending on what kind of blade it is and which plane it goes in, So that's the complicated part of the cambering, is that you actually need a slightly different radius for the 3 different common bedding angles.
And when you're doing it, you can figure out why, but you don't think about it ahead of time sometimes. And you're like, yeah, the geometry says that's going to be less.
Yeah, and then I mean, like I said, I still get it wrong. So I think it's good. I put it in the plane. I usually set my blade up, fully in the sole, so nothing's cutting. And then I just start advancing the blade out a tiny bit at a time until only one part of the blade cuts, like testing with a narrow stick on the bottom. And obviously, if it's cambered correctly, if my blade is set in the body correctly, in other words, it's not angled sideways, but it's straight, the first point of contact when I cut should be in the dead center. But if I push the blade out of the sole, let's say, to the point it cuts 2 thou deep in the center, but only a 1/2 inch section of blade cuts at all, then I've over-cambered the blade. I know immediately.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
You know, in other words, in order to get a broader cut, which is almost the full width of the blade, if I have to push the center of the blade out 15 thou, like 15 thou cutting depth, then I've way over-cambered that blade. On the other hand, if I'm only cutting 1 thou deep in the middle, and I'm also cutting almost a thou deep at the corners, then I've under-cambered it. So, you know, there's almost no camber there.
The two extremes.
So yeah, so I still make mistakes because I do it freehand, but I don't know the mistakes there till it's in the plane. And then if I do have one that's over-cambered, I'm like, you know, I've already I've already ground it and honed it. I don't want to waste my time starting over. So usually I just use it over-cambered. That means only stick the blade out a couple thou, and my cut's only 3/4 of an inch wide. I'll just leave it like that, use it narrow for a while. As soon as I need to do my next honing, I'll purposely, you know, hone away more metal in the middle of the blade than the corner so that I'm undoing some of the camber, and then the next time I use it, it's better. And then you learn your lesson and you try better the next time.
There you go.
Yeah, but I mean, you can't get it right every time when you're freehanding something like that.
Cool.
So.
Well, you and I had a little conversation before we started talking about some of this stuff, and I don't think we want to give away too many more of your secrets on the that are on the DVD. But I think some of the stuff we covered is it covers things that may not be on the DVD, or a different way to think about it, and gives a little interest to it too. And the conversation we had is about people being able to get a hold of a copy of this, and if they want, they can always go and order a copy from passionforwood.com. They've got the order form on there, and you'll send them one out. But if they want to give it a shot, they can make a comment on the post for this video, and then on the next live cast, we will pick a winner, and you can send one out to them, if I remember the conversation correctly.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no problem. Whoever you choose as the winner, you'll give them the instructions to fill out the form on my site, and they'll just post on there that it's you know, the Ravinheart contest or whatever you call it, and then I'll just ship it to them at no charge for the winner.
Sounds good.
And yeah, if anyone just wants to look it up, just passionforwood.com, click on DVDs, and you see all 10 titles there. And every web page, you know, every video has a separate web page, and there's a massive amount of info on each one, so you know exactly what's on the video. Because, you know, someone might think that the video is going to cover something that isn't on it, and I want them to know, no, here's what's on it. If this interests you, buy it. And if you're hoping I covered some other method that's not on there, then that's your decision. But it's very clearly outlined exactly what you get in your, you know, 8 hours and 43 minutes on this one.
Yeah,
there's tons there, but you know, it could go on forever.
The website really does cover what's on there too. I mean, you know, you've got the table of contents, you've got, you know, some of the snippets from the videos, and show what's on each disc, and it really covers it. If you have a chance to check it out and you're interested in some of these DVDs, I think they're really worth it, and they're great content. So. Yeah,
well, great. Thanks, Andrew. I know the price point scares some people, but once they buy one, they realize why it's not your typical $20 video, and then they normally do come back for more. So
yeah, and just
they do learn something.
Just going through the first disc of the Sharpening one, I understand why people come back and buy them, because even one disc of it, and I know there's going to be more covered in the rest, there's a lot of information. If you want to know about something, it's in there.
Yeah, it's meant to be almost a reference tool, right? It's not something you watch once and then, okay, what's next? I mean, what's going to happen is you watch it all once, try to digest it. You won't digest it all, but you'll try. And then 6 months later, you're getting ready to hand plane something. You're trying to sharpen it. You bungle it up. You go look at the table of contents. Say, what chapter is that on? Oh, yeah, chapter 4. And you fire it up. You watch half an hour's worth. Oh, yeah, that's how he does that. And then you go and do it. And you're going to refer back to it over and over again.
Yeah, or even like the one thing that I thought of was the effective cutting angles and the steps for tuning things. I can see going back going now, okay, what way to go through this the right way, or what's that cutting angle work thing? What's the best way to do these things?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do live seminars in my shop on these topics too, and it's not uncommon for someone to come to a sharpening seminar. 3 years later, they come to the same seminar again.
Mm-hmm.
Then 6 months later, they email me and say, "Can we set up a private session?" And it's like the third time through, but there's a big difference between watching it and doing it. So
Yes.
that's the benefit of the DVDs. You can watch it again and again. When it's live, it's great that you see it with your own eyes, but if you go home and somehow you can't translate that into action, your memory can only do so much for you. You can't remember everything. So the video kind of puts it in a permanent form where you can watch it hundreds of times if you need to. So definitely I'm finding a lot of customers buying my videos and then not coming to the live sessions anymore if they live nearby, because they're like, oh, I don't need it anymore. I got the video here. I can watch it every day if I want. So, but people learn different ways. Some tell me they have to see it with their eyes. Others say, no, the videos are better to me. I'd rather just buy those and sit in my living room in my underwear watching it. Not have to drive anywhere.
I say, as long as they don't come to the shop in their underwear, it's okay.
Right, exactly. In that case, all cameras are turned off.
Yes. Well, I thank you for your time on this. I thank you very much for the DVDs. It's extremely informative. And next time we'll be covering the hand planes and hand plane techniques DVD.
Yeah.
And in between now and then, if anybody listening will get a chance to check out Hendrik's site and comment on this post, and you'll be entered to win a copy.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Hendrik.
Okay, I'll talk to you next month.
Thank you.
Take care.